The last activity in lab was to do a urinalysis. And unfortunately, we don't have the kids to do this. This was sort of fake urine that they had provided for us to do some tests on. But what it does do is give us the opportunity to try out different tests for problems in urine and the kinds of things that we would look for in urine and the kinds of diagnoses they might be indicative of. So basically, urine can be assessed on a number of things. Some very obvious things like its appearance. Does it appear the normal sort of pale yellow to darker yellow amber color, or does it have some other kinds of colors which might be indicative of problems? For example, if you have intense protein breakdown from rhabdomyolysis, it could turn a dark brown or black. You could also have other indicators in urine from color that would indicate some kind of pathologies going on. Odor is another thing, that if the urine is sweet smelling or smells has other smells associated with it, that could also be an indicator. So different smells can be detected. Typically, when you look at urine, you probably get a pretty good idea of what it smells like. Again, you don't want to put your nose over the test tube and smell it, but you do want to take note of the odor. Another of the very simple tests you can use is a pH test. So typically urine will be from 4.2 to 8, so it can range from acidic to alkaline, and the average is about 6. Now, you'll see some variation in textbooks saying what the range of urine is. This particular sheet says 4.5 to 8, but somewhere in the 4.5 or low 4 to 8 range. So a lot of times we'll see that different things can change the pH of urine. So acidosis is anything that's going to move the urine to a more acidic or lower pH, and alkalosis can move the pH to a higher pH. So a lot of times anemia, vomiting is a good example, and urine retention can raise the pH and make it more alkaline. So these are just very simple tests you can do either by looking at it or just being around it close enough to smell it, and then pH can be measured with simple litmus tests. So litmus paper tests or those little pH indicator strips can be used to measure the pH of urine. The specific gravity needs a urinometer, and specific gravity is simply how dense it is. So specific gravity of 1 is defined to be distilled water at room temperature, or 20 degrees centigrade. So distilled water at 20 degrees centigrade would have a specific gravity of 1. And specific gravity just talks about the density as compared to water. So if you put something that is neutrally buoyant in water, it will have a specific gravity of 1, and it will float within the water. If you have a specific gravity that is less than 1, for example, if you had a capsule of some lipid thing, it would sit on top of the water. So it would have a specific gravity of less than 1. The density would be less than 1. If you put something that is heavier or more dense, I should say, than water into the cup of water, then it would sink, and it would sink to the bottom. So a lot of times when we look at fluids and we want to know if they have solutes in them, we can measure the specific gravity against water. And so that's exactly what specific gravity is. It's a comparison of the solute density of the fluid that you're measuring, and you're using distilled water as the control. So basically the specific gravity of urine, you'll see different ranges in different texts. This lab practical or I should say lab exercise says it should be anywhere between 1.015 and 1.025. I've seen the ranges be anywhere from 1.01 to 1.03. But basically, we would always expect urine to have a specific gravity higher than 1, because we would always expect there to be at least some solutes in it. You're never going to clear pure water out of the urine. But if you have a particularly low specific gravity, it might mean you have polyuria or you're excreting too much urine. And if you have a particularly high specific gravity, that would be an indicator that you have a lot of solutes in the urine. So you might, in that case, be dehydrated, or you might have some kind of pathological problem going on as well. Another thing we can use is the microscope. We can look for different things within urine. Casts are basically little molds that are formed within the nephron tubule, and they can consist of blood cells, proteins, stuff that sort of aggregate and then make these little forms that follow the shape of the kidney nephron. So basically, they're just little blobs of things that have stuck to the tubule wall and eventually get flushed out. And they can also be indicative of different kinds of pathologies. So you can look and see sort of what's going on in the kidney nephron by looking at the casts. Then we've got cells, and cells can just slough off of anything in the urinary tract anywhere along the way. So sometimes they don't really mean anything. Sometimes they can be indicative of problems. So for example, you could have lots of red blood cells, which might be problematic. You could have white blood cells, which could be indicative of infection. So any number of different types of cells that you might find. There could be different cells indicative of cancers and carcinomas and these kinds of things. So you could find cancer cells or whatnot in there. So you can look at one other type of thing, crystals, and these are sort of aggregations of different minerals. So a lot of crystals are, again, normal. Some are not. So we have a table here of different types of crystals that you would find in urine. So a lot of times the types of crystals you would find will depend on the pH of the urine. So we have some crystals are found in alkaline urine, some crystals are found in acidic urine, and some crystals are fairly acid to neutral. So these are all amino acids here. And if they form crystals, that can be indicative of liver disease or some kidney stones. So calculi or kidney stones. Typically, kidney stones will show up with alkaline urine. And calcium phosphate, calcium carbonate, these are pretty typical of the kinds of crystals that you would see for kidney stones, also triphosphate. So all three of these can often be indicative of kidney stones. Triphosphate can be indicative of some other things as well. Calcium oxalate and uric acid, you'll see under acid conditions. So uric acid can often be an indicator for gout. Calcium oxalate, this can be an indicator of diabetes, and also ethylene glycol poisoning. So there are a lot of different things that you can learn about a person's diet or some of their underlying physiology by looking at these different crystal types. So I would, for the purposes of the lab practical, I would know that calcium phosphate, calcium carbonate, and triphosphate can all be indicative of kidney stones, and I would know uric acid could be indicative of gout, and calcium oxalate crystals could be indicative of ethylene glycol poisoning or diabetes mellitus. Now notice also where they form. So calcium oxalate and uric acid are in acid urine, and the alkaline urine are the calcium crystals in the triphosphate. All right, then we had a bunch of case studies, and we had 4 case studies. And one of the types of tests we run on it is we would have the pH strips, which would allow us to look at the alkalinity or acidity of the urine, but we will also be running 2 other tests that we have seen before in the digestion lab. We will be running Benedict's test, which, as you recall, is going to detect sugar. So if somebody has glycosuria, so in other words, they have glucose in the urine, we would be able to detect that with Benedict's. And as you recall, that would turn the urine, if you put the light transparent blue solution in, it will turn it a green, yellow, orange, or red color depending on the amount of sugar. And if you've got a lot of sugar in there, it'll turn bright red, anywhere in between green through yellow and orange. And then we would also use our burette test. So this would test for proteins. And the presence of proteins in urine can also be problematic because it can be indicative of things like renal nephritis and some kind of pathology in the nephron. And also think about this: if you had a glomerular filtration problem where the filtration membrane was compromised, then some of those albumins could get out and they could get into the filtrate. And then that too could also be detectable in urine. And also if you have proteins in urine, then that can also be indicative of metabolic problems, It is not uncommon for people who have undergone extreme stress to have protein in urine. Sometimes you will find protein in urine after people have run a marathon or participated in some really hard, long endurance athletic event.